Sometimes the cruelest moments in life reveal the deepest kindness in others. In a world where the powerless are sold like property, one act of mercy can change everything. Alva the Quiet stands at the slave market, sack over her head, waiting to be sold. The crowd bids on her like cattle. Then Sten Ironsoul, a giant Viking warrior, pushes through the crowd. He lifts the sack from her face and says the words that shock everyone. "I'll marry you today." This isn't romance, it's rescue. But why would the most feared man in the northlands save a lowly slave girl? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost clung to the wooden planks of Skjoldheim's trading post like a stubborn memory that refused to fade. In this harsh northern settlement, where the sea met jagged cliffs and wind carried the salt of distant storms, life moved with the rhythm of survival. Here, beneath the shadow of towering pine forests and under skies that promised either bounty or brutality, people gathered not for celebration but for commerce of the most fundamental kind. Alva had learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. At 19, she possessed the quiet beauty of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Auburn hair that caught firelight like burnished copper, green eyes that held depth she dared not reveal, and hands that bore the calluses of endless labor. She was called the Quiet, not from shyness, but from wisdom earned through suffering. In a world where words could mean the difference between a meal and a beating, silence had become her shield. She had arrived at Skjoldheim 3 days prior, herded like livestock, with 12 other women whose circumstances had reduced them to commodities. The journey from her village had taken 2 weeks, each day blurring into the next as they walked in chains through forests that grew thicker and more forbidding with each mile. The trader, a gap-toothed man named Ragnar Coin-Counter, had purchased her from the local jarl after her father's debts had grown too large to ignore. Pretty enough, Ragnar had mused, examining her like a horse at market. Quiet ones fetch good prices. Men like women who don't argue with their betters. The other women in their group had varied fates awaiting them. Some would become household servants, others field workers. And a few, those whose beauty outweighed their apparent defiance, would face worse destinies in the beds of men who viewed them as entertainment rather than people. Alva had watched their faces during the journey, seeing her own fear reflected in their eyes, understanding that they all shared the same terrible knowledge. Their lives were no longer their own. Skjoldheim itself was a place where such transactions occurred with the mundane regularity of buying grain or trading furs. The settlement had grown around a natural harbor where longships could shelter from storms, and over the decades it had become a crossroads for traders, raiders, and those seeking to start fresh in the unforgiving north. The buildings were sturdy but utilitarian, log structures with steep roofs designed to shed heavy snow. Their walls chinked with moss and mud to keep out the bitter winds. The market square occupied the center of the settlement, surrounded by the Jarl's Hall, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the constant percussion of hammer on metal, several alehouses where men gathered to boast of past glories, and the homes of merchants who had grown prosperous from the endless flow of human misery. On market days, the square filled with the detritus of broken lives, weapons taken from the dead, household goods sold by the desperate, and people whose circumstances had reduced them to the status of property. Alva had spent the 3 days before the auction in a holding pen behind Ragnar's establishment, a crude wooden structure that reeked of fear and unwashed bodies. The women were fed once daily, thin gruel and hard bread, just enough to keep them from growing gaunt before their sale. They were not allowed to speak to each other, and any attempt at conversation earned a sharp blow from the guards. Alva had used the time to observe, to listen, and to prepare herself mentally for whatever fate awaited her. She knew that resistance was futile. She had seen what happened to those who fought against their circumstances. During their journey, a red-haired woman named Brynja had attempted to escape during the second night. The guards had recaptured her before dawn, and her punishment had served as a lesson to the others. Alva had learned that survival sometimes meant accepting the unacceptable, while waiting for circumstances to change. On the morning of the auction, the women were made to bathe in cold water and given clean but simple clothing, rough-spun wool dresses that were designed to be both modest and revealing enough to showcase their potential value. Their hair was combed and braided, their faces washed clean of the grime of travel. They were being prepared for display, transformed from people into products with the same care a farmer might show when preparing livestock for market. The auction block stood in the center of the square, a raised wooden platform worn smooth by countless feet. Around it, permanent stone benches provided seating for regular buyers, prosperous farmers, minor jarls, ship captains, and merchants who dealt in human cargo. The crowd that gathered on this particular morning was larger than usual, drawn perhaps by rumors of the quality of merchandise or simply by the entertainment value of watching other people's desperation unfold in public. Ragnar Coin Counter served as auctioneer, his voice carrying clearly across the square as he extolled the virtues of each woman brought before the crowd. He spoke of them as he might describe cattle, noting their apparent health, their probable fertility, their suitability for various types of labor. The men in the audience listened with the dispassionate attention of farmers evaluating breeding stock, occasionally calling out questions about a woman's background or previous experience. Alva watched from the waiting area as the first women were sold. Ingrid, a blonde woman in her 30s whose husband had died in a farming accident, went to a grain merchant for the price of 2 good horses. Astrid, barely 16 and trembling with terror, was purchased by a ship captain who dealt in cargo both legitimate and questionable. Each sale was concluded with the ring of a small bell, the transfer of silver, and the loading of another human being into a wagon that would carry her to an uncertain future. As her turn approached, Alva felt the familiar numbness that had carried her through the worst moments of her life. She had learned to separate her mind from her body during times of crisis, to retreat to a place within herself where the immediate reality could not reach her. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years from a fever that had swept through their village. She remembered her father, a good man broken by circumstances beyond his control, who had sold his daughter not from cruelty, but from desperation. She forgave him as she had forgiven all the small cruelties and large injustices that had brought her to this moment. The sack that was placed over her head smelled of grain and fear. Countless other women had worn it before her, each leaving behind the invisible residue of their terror. The coarse burlap scratched against her skin, and the sudden darkness was disorienting after the bright morning light. She could hear the crowd's murmur growing more animated as bidding began, voices calling out numbers that represented the monetary value of her remaining years. Through the fabric, she could hear Ragnar's voice. "Here we have Alva, called the Quiet, 19 years old, healthy stock, good for household work or field labor, tractable disposition, no history of rebellion. Bidding starts at 10 pieces of silver. The calls came quickly, 12 silver, 15, 18. She could distinguish individual voices in the crowd. A farmer discussing her potential as a kitchen servant, a merchant wondering aloud about her literacy, a ship captain making crude jokes about her other possible uses. Each bid felt like another link in the chain that would bind her to a life she had no voice in choosing. 25 silver, 30. The bidding had grown heated, and she could sense the competitive atmosphere that sometimes seized men when they became focused on acquiring something that others wanted. She was no longer a person in their minds. She had become a prize, an object of desire measured purely in terms of utility and possession. It was at 32 pieces of silver, when the bidding had slowed and seemed ready to conclude, that everything changed. A new voice cut through the chatter of the crowd, deep and commanding in a way that brought immediate silence. Even through the sack, Alva could sense the shift in the atmosphere, conversations stopping mid-sentence, the rustle of people turning to look, a sudden tension that seemed to charge the very air. "Hold," The single word carried such authority that even Ragnar Coin-Counter paused in his practiced auctioneering. Footsteps approached the platform, measured, unhurried, but somehow conveying immense purpose. The crowd parted, with the respectful fear reserved for those who had earned both power and reputation through deeds rather than birthright. Then, without warning or ceremony, large hands lifted the sack from her head. Alva blinked against the sudden return of daylight, her eyes adjusting to reveal the face of the man who had spoken. He stood before her like something from the old stories, easily 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His hair was the color of winter wheat, braided with silver threads that caught the morning light. His beard was full but carefully kept, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who had spent years facing both the elements and human enemies. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue like ice on deep water, studying her with an intensity that seemed to see past the surface of things. This was Sten Ironsoul, though Alva knew him only by reputation. Every child in the northlands had heard tales of the giant warrior who could cleave a man in half with a single blow, who had led successful raids from the Frankish coast to the Byzantine borders, who was said to be favored by the war god himself. He wore his fame like a well-fitted cloak, present but not ostentatious, significant but not boastful. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Alva saw in his face not the predatory hunger she had expected from another potential buyer, but something else entirely, a recognition perhaps, or a decision being made in real time. His eyes held no cruelty, no calculation of her potential value as property. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like respect. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent square. "I'll marry you today." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Conversations erupted on all sides. Shocked exclamations, confused questions, nervous laughter from those who thought they might have misheard. Ragnar Coin-Counter stood with his mouth agape, clearly uncertain how to proceed when the normal rules of commerce had been so completely overturned. But Sten Ironsoul paid no attention to the chaos his words had created. He continued to look at Alva, waiting for something. Her response, perhaps, or simply her understanding of what he had offered. She saw in his expression not romantic passion, but something far more valuable, deliberate choice. He had not spoken from impulse or desire, but from a decision made with full knowledge of its consequences. For Alva, the moment stretched like a held breath. She understood, with the intuitive clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis, that this was not a proposal in any conventional sense. It was a rescue disguised as romance, a shield offered by someone who had the power to make it meaningful. In a world where her choices had been reduced to which form of servitude she would endure, he was offering her something unprecedented, the possibility of dignity. She nodded once, a small gesture that nevertheless carried the weight of accepting a completely different future than the one that had seemed inevitable only moments before. The silence that followed Sten's declaration stretched across the market square like ice forming on still water. Then, as if a dam had burst, voices erupted from every direction. Men who had been calmly appraising human merchandise moments before now shouted questions, protests and demands for explanation. The careful order of the slave auction had dissolved into chaos. "You cannot simply claim her," bellowed Thorvald Bloodaxe, a prosperous farmer whose bid of 32 silver had been interrupted. His face had turned the color of old leather, left too long in the sun. "This is a lawful auction. I have the highest bid." Ragnar Coin-Counter wrung his hands, caught between his desire for profit and his fear of the legendary warrior who had disrupted his carefully orchestrated sale. "Lord Sten, surely there are proper procedures, arrangements to be made." But Sten Ironsoul remained focused entirely on Alva, as if the crowd's protests were no more significant than the buzzing of summer insects. He extended his hand toward her, palm up, in a gesture that somehow managed to be both commanding and respectful. "Will you come with me?" The question surprised her. In all her 19 years, Alva could not remember the last time someone had asked for her consent rather than simply taking what they wanted. Even her father, when circumstances had forced him to sell her, had not asked. He had simply informed her of what must be done. But here was this giant of a man, feared throughout the northlands, treating her as if her choice mattered. She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of years wielding sword and axe, and was surprised by the gentleness of his grip. As he helped her down from the auction block, she caught sight of his ship anchored in the harbor, a magnificent longship with a carved dragon's head that seemed to watch the proceedings with ancient wisdom. "This is highly irregular," protested Magnus Silvertongue, the settlement's law speaker, pushing through the crowd with the self-importance of a man accustomed to being the final authority on matters of law and custom. "Marriage cannot be declared so casually. There are rituals to observe, dowries to negotiate, families to consult." Sten turned his pale blue gaze on the law speaker with such intensity that Magnus took an involuntary step backward. "I have claimed her according to the old laws. Any man who wishes to dispute my claim may do so with steel." The crowd shifted uneasily. Everyone present knew that challenging Sten Ironsoul to combat was tantamount to choosing an elaborate form of suicide. His reputation had been earned through decades of warfare, and the scars visible on his arms and hands testified to battles won against odds that would have broken lesser men. Thorvald Bloodaxe, however, was not easily intimidated. His own reputation as a fighter was considerable, and his pride had been wounded by the casual dismissal of his bid. "And what of compensation for those of us who have lost coin this day? I traveled 3 days to attend this auction. Then you have learned the value of arriving earlier," Sten replied, his tone carrying just enough amusement to transform the insult into something almost playful. "As for compensation," he reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a handful of silver coins, tossing them onto the platform where they rang against the wood like bells. "For any inconvenience." The amount was easily twice what the highest bid had reached, and Alva watched as the anger in Thorvald's eyes transformed into something approaching respect. In the harsh economics of the northlands, such casual generosity spoke to wealth and power that commanded attention. But it was Magnus Silvertongue who voiced the question that lingered in every mind present. Why? Why would the great Sten Ironsoul, who could have his pick of any jarl's daughter from here to the Frankish coast, choose to marry a slave girl with no dowry, no family connections, no political advantage? For the first time since he had spoken, Sten's attention shifted away from Alva to address the crowd directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Because I choose to. And in this land, a man's choice in marriage should be his own, not subject to the approval of merchants and coin counters." The answer satisfied no one completely, but it carried enough authority to silence further protests. In a society where personal honor and individual will were sacred concepts, few men were prepared to argue that someone should not be free to make their own choices. However incomprehensible those choices might seem, Ragnar Coin Counter, ever practical, seized on the one aspect of the situation he could understand, the financial transaction. The girl's price must still be paid. 40 pieces of silver given the disruption, and 50, Sten said, producing another handful of coins. "And consider our business concluded." As the silver changed hands, Alva found herself observing the reactions of the other women still awaiting their turn on the auction block. Some watched with obvious envy, seeing in her impossible rescue a reminder of their own helplessness. Others looked confused, unable to comprehend how fortune could change so dramatically in a single moment. A few seemed hopeful, as if Sten's unexpected intervention might somehow extend to them as well. But it was the expression on the face of Brynja, the red-haired woman who had attempted escape during their journey, that stayed with Alva. Where she expected to see jealousy or resentment, she found instead a look of fierce satisfaction, as if witnessing one woman's liberation somehow vindicated all of their suffering. The ceremony can be performed immediately, Magnus Silvertongue announced, apparently deciding that if he could not prevent this irregular marriage, he could at least ensure it was conducted properly. I can perform the binding myself, with the crowd as witnesses. Sten shook his head. Not here. Not in a place that reeks of slavery and fear. We will be married aboard my ship, with the sky as our roof and the sea as our witness. As they walked through the crowd toward the harbor, Alva became aware of the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. Some called Sten mad for throwing away his freedom on a woman of no importance. Others speculated about hidden motives. Perhaps she was the daughter of some displaced noble, or carried secret knowledge that made her valuable beyond her apparent station. The truth, Alva realized, was both simpler and more complex than any of their theories. She had seen something in Sten's eyes during their brief exchange on the platform, a recognition of shared understanding about the nature of power and its proper use. He had not rescued her from romantic impulse, but from a deeper conviction about the responsibilities that came with strength. As they reached the harbor, she caught sight of his crew preparing the longship for departure. These were hardened warriors, men whose loyalty had been earned through shared danger and common cause. They watched their captains approach with curious eyes, but no apparent judgment. If Sten Ironsoul had chosen to marry a slave girl, they seemed to suggest, then he doubtless had good reasons that would become clear in time. The ship itself was a masterwork of northern craftsmanship, its hull carved from oak that had been seasoned for decades before shaping. The dragon's head at the prow had been carved with such skill that it seemed almost alive, its eyes scanning the horizon for threats or opportunities. This was not merely a vessel but a home, a symbol of freedom and self-determination that stood in stark contrast to the chains and cages of the slave market. As Sten helped her aboard, Alva realized that her old life had ended as abruptly as a door slamming shut. Everything she had been, the quiet girl who survived through invisibility, the desperate woman accepting whatever fate others chose for her, had been left behind on that auction platform. What lay ahead was entirely unknown, a blank page on which a new story could be written, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, the unknown felt like possibility rather than threat. Standing on the deck of Sten Ironsoul's longship, with the morning sun breaking through the clouds and the salt wind carrying away the last vestiges of her life as property, Alva allowed herself something she had not dared to feel in years: hope. The wedding ceremony took place on the deck of Sten's longship as the sun reached its zenith, casting everything in sharp, clear light that seemed to bless the proceedings with divine approval. Magnus Silvertongue had followed them to the harbor, apparently determined to ensure that whatever irregularities had marked this union's beginning, the ceremony itself would conform to proper tradition. Sten's crew gathered in a respectful circle around the ship's mast, their weathered faces showing genuine pleasure at witnessing their captain's marriage. These were men who had followed him through storms and battles, who had shared both treasure and hardship in equal measure. Their acceptance of Alva seemed immediate and unquestioned. If Sten had chosen her, then she belonged among them. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Magnus spoke the ancient words that bound two lives together under the eyes of gods and men, while Sten and Alva exchanged rings forged from silver, taken in raids along distant coasts. When the law speaker asked if each party came to the marriage willingly, their responses carried different but equally significant meanings. "I do," Sten declared, his voice carrying across the water with the certainty of a man who had never doubted his own decisions. "I do," Alva replied, and in those two words lay the first choice she had been allowed to make about her own life in longer than she cared to remember. The artifact that would come to symbolize this new beginning was the silver arm ring that Sten placed upon her wrist, not just a piece of jewelry, but a visible sign of her transformed status. In northern custom, such rings marked a woman as belonging to a household of substance and protection. No one who saw it would mistake her for property to be bartered or claimed. As the ceremony concluded and the crew cheered their approval, Alva found herself studying the faces of the men who were now, in some sense, her family. They were a diverse group, some young and eager, others grizzled veterans whose scars told stories of survival against overwhelming odds. What united them was their obvious loyalty to Sten and their acceptance of her presence among them. Eric Stormcrow, Sten's second-in-command, approached with a goblet of mead and a respectful nod. "Welcome aboard, Lady Alva. The ship is honored by your presence." The title caught her off guard. Lady was not a word that had ever been applied to her before, but she saw in Eric's eyes that it was offered with genuine respect rather than mere courtesy. These men understood that their captain's choices carried weight and meaning, beyond the obvious. As the celebration continued around them, Sten drew her aside to the ship's stern, where they could speak without being overheard. For the first time since their eyes had met on the auction platform, they were truly alone together. "You have questions," he said, not accusingly, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Alva nodded. "Why me? You could have had anyone. A jarl's daughter, a rich merchant's widow, a woman who could bring you land or alliance or political advantage. Instead, you chose someone with nothing to offer." Sten was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes focused on the horizon where sea met sky. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of experiences she could only imagine. 3 years ago, I raided a monastery on the Frankish coast. Rich prize, gold, silver, illuminated manuscripts worth a fortune to the right buyers. But when we broke down the doors, we found they had been using slave labor. Children, mostly, taken from villages we had burned the season before. He paused, his jaw tightening with remembered anger. My men wanted the treasure, said the children were just part of the spoils, to be sold when we returned home. I could have taken them. By the law of raid and conquest, they belonged to us. But you didn't, Alva said, beginning to understand. No, I gave them passage back to whatever remained of their homes. Divided the monastery's gold among my crew to compensate for the lost profit. He turned to look at her directly. A leader's strength is not measured by what he can take, but by what he chooses to protect. The words settled between them like a bridge being built, connecting her understanding of his character to the inexplicable generosity he had shown her. This was not romance, she realized, at least not in any conventional sense. It was something deeper and more deliberate, a man with the power to choose, deciding to use that power in service of something larger than his own desires. You see me as another child to be rescued, she said, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone finally understanding her situation. I see you as someone who deserves the chance to choose her own path, Sten replied. What you make of that chance is entirely up to you. As afternoon turned toward evening, the ship departed Skjoldheim with the tide. Alva stood at the rail, watching the settlement shrink into the distance until it became just another cluster of buildings along a coastline that stretched endlessly in both directions. She felt no sadness at leaving. There had been nothing there worth mourning. Her thoughts turned instead to the practical realities of her new situation. She was now married to a man she barely knew, sailing toward a destination she had not chosen, surrounded by warriors whose loyalty lay with their captain rather than with her. The rescue that had seemed so miraculous on the auction platform now revealed its complications. That evening, as the crew settled into the rhythm of travel, Sten approached her with a bundle of clothing and a revelation that surprised her further. "These belonged to my sister," he said, offering her the garments. "She died 5 years ago in a fever outbreak. You are similar in size." The clothes were well made, wool dyed in deep blues and greens, with silver clasps and embroidered details that spoke of wealth and care. As Alva examined them, she found herself wondering about the woman who had worn them. What kind of person she had been, and whether Sten's protective instincts toward her had somehow influenced his decision to rescue a stranger. "What was her name?" she asked. "Sigrid the Bright. She had your courage, I think, though hers was expressed differently. Where you survived through quiet endurance. She survived through fierce resistance to anything that tried to diminish her. That night, as the ship anchored in a sheltered cove and the crew settled into sleep, Alva found herself lying awake in the small cabin that had been prepared for her. Through the thin wooden walls, she could hear the gentle sounds of the ship at rest, creaking timbers, lapping water, the quiet conversations of men on watch duty. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to truly rest. The silver arm ring caught the moonlight streaming through the cabin's small window, a tangible reminder that her life had been fundamentally transformed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties. But tonight, she could simply exist without fear of what morning might bring. As sleep finally claimed her, Alva's last conscious thought was of Sten's words about choosing one's own path. She had spent so many years having her choices made for her that the concept felt foreign and slightly frightening. But lying there in the gentle motion of the ship, surrounded by the evidence of her changed circumstances, she began to imagine what it might feel like to be truly free. The first week aboard Sten's longship revealed the complexity of her new existence. While she was no longer property to be bought and sold, Alva discovered that freedom came with its own set of challenges and expectations that she had never considered. The crew, though respectful, remained watchful. She could feel their eyes upon her as she moved about the ship, not with hostility, but with the careful attention of men trying to understand how this unexpected addition to their brotherhood would affect their established order. Some, like Eric Stormcrow, made genuine efforts to include her in conversations and daily routines. Others maintained a polite distance, unsure how to interact with a woman who occupied an undefined position in their hierarchy. Olaf the Skald, the ship's storyteller and keeper of songs, proved to be her most valuable guide to understanding the culture she had suddenly been thrust into. He was an older man whose fighting days were behind him, but whose knowledge of law, custom, and tradition made him indispensable to Sten's leadership. On the third day of their voyage, he approached her as she sat mending a torn sail, work she had taken upon herself without being asked. "You handle needle and thread with skill," he observed, settling beside her with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been stiffened by years of cold seas and hard sleeping. "My mother taught me," Alva replied, not looking up from her work. "She said that useful hands were never idle hands, and idle hands invited trouble." Olaf chuckled, a sound like wind through old timber. "Wise woman. But tell me, Lady Alva, what do you understand of your husband's reputation? What stories have reached your ears about Sten Ironsoul?" The question surprised her. In the village where she had grown up, tales of the legendary warrior had been common enough. Stories of raids and battles, of treasure won and enemies defeated. But she suspected that Olaf was asking about something deeper than mere battlefield prowess. "I know he is feared," she said carefully, "that his name is spoken with respect from the Frankish coast to the Byzantine borders, that he has never lost a battle or abandoned his men." "All true," Olaf agreed, "but incomplete. Do you know why his crew follows him with such devotion? Why men who could earn fortunes serving other captains choose instead to sail under his banner?" Alva shook her head, genuinely curious about the answer, because Sten Ironsoul has never asked any man to face a danger he would not face himself, never claimed a portion of treasure larger than his contribution earned, and never abandoned a principle for the sake of convenience. Olaf's voice carried the weight of personal experience. "I have sailed with many captains in my time. Most lead through fear or greed or the promise of easy wealth. Sten leads through example." As if summoned by their conversation, Sten himself appeared from the ship's stern, where he had been consulting with the navigator about their course. His presence seemed to fill the available space, not through physical size alone, but through the quiet authority that surrounded him like an invisible cloak. "How are you finding life aboard ship?" he asked Alva, his tone suggesting genuine interest in her answer. "Different," she replied honestly. "I am still learning what is expected of me." "Nothing is expected of you beyond what you choose to give," Sten said, settling beside them with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in his environment. This ship is not a household where women serve at the pleasure of men. It is a brotherhood, and you are now part of that brotherhood. The statement was remarkable not just for its content, but for the matter-of-fact way it was delivered. Alva had grown up in a world where a woman's role was clearly defined by her relationship to the men around her: daughter, wife, servant, or property. The idea that she could simply exist as herself, contributing what she chose to contribute, was revolutionary. Over the following days, she began to test the boundaries of this new freedom. She offered to help with navigation, having learned to read the stars from her father, who had once been a traveling merchant. Eric Stormcrow accepted her assistance gratefully, admitting that an extra pair of educated eyes was always valuable when traveling unfamiliar waters. She also began to assert herself in small ways that would have been unthinkable in her previous life. When Gunnar the Hot-Tempered, a young warrior still prone to testing limits, made a crude comment about her former status as a slave, she responded with such quiet dignity that he found himself apologizing without quite understanding why. "You carry yourself like a woman born to authority," Olaf observed after witnessing this exchange. "Were you perhaps more than you appeared when Sten found you at that auction?" Alva considered the question carefully. "My father was a merchant before debts, and bad harvests reduced our circumstances. I learned to read and write, to calculate accounts, to judge the quality of goods and the character of men. But none of that mattered once we lost everything. It matters now," Sten said, having overheard their conversation. "Those skills will be valuable when we reach our destination." "Which is?" Alva asked, realizing that in all the days since leaving Skjoldheim, no one had actually told her where they were traveling. "Ironhold," Sten replied. "My family's estate in the northern fjords. It has been without a proper mistress since my sister's death. The household has grown careless in its management, and the account-keeping has suffered from neglect." The revelation brought both opportunity and anxiety. Alva understood that she was being offered the chance to prove her value through useful work, rather than mere presence. But it also meant that her performance would be judged by people who had known and loved Sigrid the Bright, and who might resent seeing her place taken by a former slave. That evening, as the ship navigated through increasingly familiar waters that spoke of approaching journey's end, Alva found herself standing again at the rail, watching the coastline slide past in the gathering dusk. The landscape here was different from the gentler shores around Skjoldheim, wilder, more dramatic, with towering cliffs and narrow fjords that promised both beauty and isolation. Sten joined her at the rail, as had become his custom during the quiet hours of evening watch. They often stood together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, while sharing the experience of watching the sea change color as day faded into night. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Alva replied honestly, "but I think that might be the point. If I knew exactly what to expect, it wouldn't really be a new beginning." Sten nodded, and she thought she saw approval in his expression. Wisdom often comes disguised as uncertainty. The people who claim to know everything usually understand very little. As the first stars appeared overhead, Alva found herself thinking about the silver arm ring that marked her transformed status. Tomorrow they would reach Ironhold, and she would begin the next chapter of a life that had already been rewritten beyond recognition. Whatever challenges awaited her there, she would face them not as property or victim, but as a woman who had been given the chance to choose her own path forward. Ironhold revealed itself gradually as their longship navigated the narrow fjord that served as its natural harbor. First came the watchtowers, stone sentinels perched on cliff tops that commanded views of both sea and land approaches. Then the terraced fields, where winter barley grew in neat rows, evidence of careful agricultural planning. Finally, the settlement itself emerged from behind a protective headland, a collection of substantial buildings dominated by a great hall whose timber walls had been weathered silver by decades of northern storms, the artifact that would define this new chapter of Alva's life was already waiting for her, though she did not yet know it. The household ledger of Ironhold, a thick volume bound in leather and filled with years of careful record-keeping that had fallen into neglect since Sigrid's death. This book would become both her tool and her test, the means by which she would prove her worth to a community that had not asked for her presence. As their ship approached the wooden pier that extended into the deep water of the fjord, Alva could see people gathering to welcome their lord's return. The crowd was substantial, perhaps 100 souls, including household servants, field workers, craftsmen, and the families that depended on Ironhold's prosperity for their survival. Their faces showed the mixture of anticipation and curiosity that always accompanied a great man's homecoming. But she could sense an undercurrent of uncertainty as word spread about the woman standing beside him. Sten's hand touched her elbow gently, a gesture of reassurance that she found surprisingly comforting. "They are good people," he said quietly, "but they have been without proper leadership for too long. They will test you, not from malice, but from necessity. A household this size cannot function without someone willing to make difficult decisions." The gangplank was lowered, and Sten strode onto the pier with the confident bearing of a man returning to his own domain. The crowd parted respectfully as he approached, but Alva noticed that their attention kept shifting to her, studying her clothes, her bearing, her relationship to their lord. She could almost hear the questions forming in their minds. Who was this woman? How had she come to stand beside Sten Ironsoul? What did her presence mean for the established order of their community? Astrid the Greywise, Ironhold's senior housekeeper, stepped forward to greet them. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, whose weathered face spoke of a lifetime spent managing the countless details that kept a great household functioning. Her eyes, sharp as winter starlight, took in every detail of Alva's appearance before settling on the silver armring that marked her status. "Welcome home, Lord Sten," Astrid said, her voice carrying the familiarity of long service. "The household has kept well in your absence, though there are matters requiring your attention." "I am sure there are," Sten replied. "Astrid, I would like you to meet my wife, Alva. She will be taking charge of the household management." The statement sent a visible ripple through the assembled crowd. Astrid's expression remained carefully neutral, but Alva caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested surprise, possibly concern. This was a woman who had effectively run Ironhold since Sigrid's death, and the sudden appearance of a new mistress represented a fundamental change to the balance of power she had grown accustomed to. "My lady," Astrid said, offering a respectful nod that nevertheless managed to convey a degree of reservation. "I hope you will find Ironhold to your liking." As they walked through the settlement toward the great hall, Alva observed the signs of both prosperity and neglect that Sten had mentioned. The buildings were well constructed and fundamentally sound, but many showed evidence of deferred maintenance. Loose shutters, patches in the thatch that didn't quite match, fences that needed repair. The fields were productive, but could clearly benefit from more careful management. This was a place with good bones that had been drifting without strong direction. The great hall itself was magnificent, its soaring timber roof supported by carved pillars that told the story of Sten's lineage in intricate detail. Weapons and shields hung from the walls, trophies of successful raids mixed with family heirlooms that spoke of generations of honorable service. At the far end, a massive fireplace dominated the space, its hearth large enough to warm the entire hall, even in the depths of winter. But it was the smaller details that caught Alva's attention. Dust in corners that should have been swept, silver cups that needed polishing, tapestries that hung slightly askew. These were not signs of poverty or incompetence, but rather the subtle decay that occurred when no single person felt ultimate responsibility for maintaining standards. That evening, after a feast had been held to celebrate Sten's return, Astrid approached Alva with the household ledger tucked under her arm. The older woman's manner was polite but guarded, like someone preparing to negotiate from a position of uncertain strength. "Perhaps you would like to review the accounts." "My lady," Astrid said, placing the heavy book on the table between them. Lady Sigrid always insisted on understanding every detail of the household's finances. Alva accepted the ledger with appropriate gravity, recognizing the test that was being offered. This was Astrid's way of determining whether the new mistress of Ironhold possessed the knowledge and attention to detail necessary for her position. The older woman was watching carefully, probably hoping to find evidence that this unexpected marriage had been a romantic impulse rather than a considered decision. As Alva opened the ledger and began to examine its contents, she felt a familiar sense of confidence returning. Numbers had always made sense to her in ways that human relationships sometimes did not. Here was a language she understood completely, the careful tracking of income and expenditure, the patterns that revealed both opportunity and waste. The story of a household's true health told in columns of precise notation. What she found confirmed her initial observations. Ironhold was fundamentally prosperous, with income from farming, fishing, and trade, providing a solid foundation for the community's welfare. But the record-keeping had grown sloppy since Sigrid's death, with expenses inadequately documented and income streams not properly tracked. Money was being lost not through theft or extravagance, but through simple inattention to detail. The barley harvest figures seem incomplete, Alva observed, pointing to a series of entries that showed significant gaps. And there's no record of the fishing boat repairs that I can see mentioned in the correspondence files. Astrid's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, surprise replacing some of her initial wariness. You read quickly, my lady. Most people find the accounts challenging. Numbers tell stories, Alva replied, continuing to turn pages and noting discrepancies. This story suggests a household with excellent potential that needs more systematic management. Nothing that cannot be corrected with attention and effort. For the first time since their introduction, Astrid's smile seemed genuine rather than merely polite. Lady Sigrid used to say something very similar. She believed that a well-managed household was like a well-tuned instrument, capable of beautiful music when all the parts worked in harmony. As the evening progressed and Alva continued to review the ledger, she became aware that word of her competence was spreading through the hall. Servants who had been stealing glances at her throughout the feast now approached more directly, asking questions about household procedures and offering information about problems that had been accumulating during the period of uncertain leadership. When Sten found her hours later, still bent over the accounts by candlelight, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression of quiet satisfaction. You are settling in well, he observed. I am finding my place, Alva corrected. There is much work to be done, but good people to do it with. Astrid knows this household better than anyone. She simply needs someone to make the final decisions and take responsibility for the consequences. Sten nodded approvingly. That is exactly what I hoped you would understand. Authority without wisdom is tyranny, but wisdom without authority is merely good advice that no one follows. As Alva closed the ledger and prepared to retire to the chambers that had been prepared for her, she realized that she had successfully passed the first test of her new life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she began implementing the changes that Ironhold needed. But tonight she could rest knowing that she had proven herself capable of the work she had been given. 3 months into her life at Ironhold, Alva had transformed from an uncertain newcomer into the undisputed mistress of the household. The changes she had implemented were visible everywhere, from the meticulously organized storerooms to the newly efficient rotation of duties that ensured no essential task was ever neglected. The household ledger, once a source of frustration for Astrid, had become a model of clarity and precision under Alva's careful management. But it was the arrival of an unexpected visitor that would test not just her administrative skills, but her understanding of the complex loyalties and ancient grudges that shaped the political landscape of the northlands. The artifact that would define this new challenge was a bone chess set, carved from walrus ivory and inlaid with silver, that sat prominently in the Great Hall's place of honor. It had belonged to Sten's father, and according to tradition, no important decision affecting Ironhold was made without at least one game being played beside its carved figures. The chess set represented the strategic thinking that had kept the estate prosperous through generations of political upheaval. Bjorn Ravenshield arrived on a grey morning when autumn was beginning its slow surrender to winter. His longship bore the dragon-head prow that marked him as a jarl of significant standing, and the 40 warriors who accompanied him were well-armed and battle-tested. More concerning was the fact that he had come unannounced, a breach of protocol that suggested either emergency or deliberate insult. Alva watched from the hall's windows as Sten met the visitors at the harbour, noting the careful formality of their greeting. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in both men's postures, the way their hands rested casually near their sword hilts, the positioning of their respective followers that spoke of old grievances barely held in check. Bjorn Ravenshield, Astrid murmured, appearing beside her at the window with the silent efficiency that had made her such a valuable ally. He was betrothed to Lady Sigrid before her death, a political arrangement that would have united two of the strongest houses in the northern fjords. Alva felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the shutters. And now he sees me as an obstacle to claiming what he believes should have been his. Possibly, Astrid agreed. Or he may simply be testing Lord Sten's resolve. Bjorn has never been comfortable with anyone else holding more influence than he possesses. As the two groups made their way toward the hall, Alva quickly reviewed what she knew of northern politics and marriage customs. A betrothal, even one ended by death, created bonds of obligation and expectation that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Bjorn's claim to influence at Ironhold was not merely personal. It was tied to questions of alliance, trade agreements, and the delicate balance of power that kept the fjords from descending into open warfare. The feast that evening was a masterpiece of diplomatic complexity disguised as generous hospitality. Alva had worked with the kitchen staff to prepare dishes that would demonstrate Ironhold's prosperity without appearing ostentatious, while ensuring that every detail of service reflected the household's efficiency and organization. She understood that she was being evaluated not just as Sten's wife, but as the woman who now held the position that had been intended for Bjorn's bride. Bjorn himself proved to be a man of perhaps 35 years, with the kind of rugged handsomeness that spoke of good breeding and careful attention to physical conditioning. His manner toward her was scrupulously polite, but she caught the calculating intelligence behind his courtesy. This was someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm, intimidation, and strategic thinking. Your household runs with impressive efficiency, Lady Alva, he commented as the evening's entertainment began. Olaf the Skald, recounting tales of great battles and noble sacrifices. Sigrid would have approved of the changes you have made. The statement was expertly crafted to accomplish several things simultaneously. It acknowledged her competence while reminding everyone present of her predecessor, and it established Bjorn's authority to judge her performance based on his intimate knowledge of the woman she had replaced. Lady Sigrid set high standards, Alva replied carefully. I try to honor her memory by maintaining them. Indeed, Bjorn agreed, his pale eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. Though I confess curiosity about how a woman of your background came to possess such sophisticated understanding of household management. Such skills are usually learned from childhood in houses of noble breeding. The challenge in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Without directly questioning her worthiness to hold her position, he was reminding everyone present of her origins as a slave, suggesting that her competence was somehow artificial or inappropriate given her station at birth. It was Sten who responded, his voice carrying the quiet authority that could silence a roomful of arguing warriors. My wife's abilities speak for themselves, as does her character. The circumstances of her birth are less important than the choices she has made since. Of course, Bjorn said smoothly. But Alva could see that he had accomplished his goal of introducing doubt and tension into what should have been a pleasant social occasion. Later that evening, as the formal festivities wound down, Bjorn approached Sten with the bone chess set, suggesting a game for old time's sake. Alva understood that this was not merely entertainment, but a form of ritualized combat, a way for two strong-willed men to test each other's strategic thinking without resorting to actual violence. As she watched them play, she began to understand the deeper currents of their rivalry. Each move on the board was accompanied by seemingly casual conversation that touched on trade routes, alliance obligations, and the shifting balance of power among the northern jarls. Bjorn was probing for information about Sten's plans and commitments, while simultaneously demonstrating his own strategic sophistication. "Your marriage was unexpected," Bjorn commented as he moved his queen into a threatening position. "Some among the jarls wonder whether it signals a change in your approach to alliance building." "My marriage was my choice," Sten replied, countering with a knight move that protected his king while opening new offensive possibilities. "As are all decisions affecting my household and my honor." "Naturally," Bjorn agreed, "though choices made in isolation can sometimes have consequences that extend beyond the immediate parties involved." Alva recognized the veiled threat in his words. Bjorn was suggesting that Sten's marriage to her had disrupted expectations and agreements that reached far beyond Ironhold, and that there might be a price to pay for such independence. The game continued for another hour, with neither man able to gain a decisive advantage. When they finally agreed to a draw, both players seemed satisfied that they had taken the other's measure without revealing too much about their own capabilities and intentions. As Bjorn and his men prepared to depart the following morning, he made a point of speaking privately with Alva, ostensibly to thank her for the hospitality, but actually to deliver a message that chilled her to the bone. "You have done well here," he said, his tone suggesting genuine admiration. "Sigrid herself could not have managed things more efficiently. I hope you will be able to continue this excellent work for many years to come." The words themselves were complimentary, but his tone carried an unmistakable implication. Her position was more precarious than it appeared, and powerful men were watching to see whether she would prove to be a temporary inconvenience or a permanent obstacle to their plans. As his longship disappeared into the morning mist, Alva found herself standing beside the bone chess set, studying the carved figures that had witnessed so many strategic battles over the generations. She understood now that her rescue from the slave market had been only the beginning of her challenges. The real test of her new life was not whether she could manage a household, but whether she could navigate the treacherous currents of northern politics while protecting both her position and the man who had given her the chance to claim it. The revelation came on a morning when winter had finally claimed the fjords, transforming Ironhold into a fortress of ice and stone against the howling winds that swept down from the mountains. Alva was in the archive chamber, a small room behind the great hall where generations of correspondence and legal documents were stored in carefully organized chests, when she discovered something that would redefine everything she thought she understood about her. Marriage and her place in the complex web of northern politics. The artifact that would change her world was hidden within a bundle of seemingly routine trade agreements. A letter bearing the seal of Magnus Silvertongue, written 2 months before Sten's arrival at the Skjoldheim slave market. The parchment was of high quality, the kind reserved for communications of particular importance, and its contents made her hands tremble as she read. "To Sten Ironsoul, Lord of Ironhold, greetings. As requested, I have identified a suitable candidate for your purposes. The girl called Alva the Quiet possesses the qualities you specified: literacy, numeracy, administrative experience, and most importantly, no family connections that would complicate future arrangements. Her father's debts will deliver her to the Skjoldheim market within the month. I await your instructions regarding the timing of your arrival." Your faithful servant, Magnus Silvertongue, law speaker of Skildheim. The words seemed to rearrange themselves before her eyes as their full meaning became clear. Her rescue had not been a spontaneous act of mercy. It had been planned, orchestrated, calculated down to the precise timing of Sten's dramatic appearance at the auction. Everything she had believed about that pivotal moment, the unexpected intervention, the choice to save a stranger, the risk taken for honor rather than advantage, had been carefully constructed theater. She sat in the archive chamber for a long time, the letter still clutched in her shaking hands, while winter wind rattled the shutters, and the implications of her discovery spread through her mind like poison through water. How much had been genuine? How much had been performance? And most importantly, what did this revelation mean about the man she had come to respect, admire, and perhaps even love? When she finally emerged from the archive chamber, she found Sten in his study, reviewing reports from the watchtowers about the growing severity of the winter storms. He looked up as she entered, and she saw his expression change as he took in her appearance. The pallor of shock, the way she held herself as if physical pain accompanied emotional betrayal. "You found something," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. His pale blue eyes moved to the letter in her hand, and she saw recognition there, followed by something that might have been relief. "You knew I would," Alva said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "You left it where I would eventually discover it. Why?" Sten set aside his reports and gestured for her to take the chair across from his desk. When she remained standing, he rose as well, moving to the window where grey afternoon light illuminated the harsh beauty of the winter landscape. "Because you deserved the truth," he said finally, "and because I needed you to understand the full extent of what we faced together. We." The word came out sharper than she intended. "There is no we if everything between us has been built on deception." "Not deception," Sten corrected, turning to face her directly. "Incomplete disclosure perhaps, but not deception. Everything I told you about why I chose to marry you was true. I simply did not explain how I came to be in a position to make that choice." Alva studied his face, searching for signs of the manipulation she now suspected, but finding instead the same quiet honesty that had characterized all their interactions since that first moment on the auction platform. "Explain it to me then. Make me understand why you found it necessary to orchestrate my rescue, rather than simply choosing someone else. Someone whose freedom would not have required such elaborate planning." Sten was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts with the same careful precision he brought to matters of strategy and governance. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of experiences that went far beyond their personal relationship. 6 months ago, I received word from contacts throughout the northern fjords that Bjorn Ravenshield was building a coalition of Jarls who felt that my independence threatened their collective interests. My refusal to form the expected alliance through marriage to Sigrid had been noted and resented. They believed that a man without family obligations was dangerous, too free to act according to his own judgment rather than the broader interests of the established order. He moved away from the window, beginning to pace the small study with the restless energy of someone accustomed to action rather than lengthy explanations. I realized that I needed a wife, not for romantic reasons, but for political ones. Someone who would demonstrate my commitment to stability and tradition while actually strengthening my position rather than constraining it. And you decided that a former slave with no family connections would serve that purpose better than a Jarl's daughter, Alva said, beginning to understand the strategic thinking behind his choice. I decided that a woman of proven competence and independent character would serve that purpose better than someone whose primary loyalty would be to her birth family, rather than to our shared future, Sten corrected. The fact that you had no existing political obligations was indeed important, but so was your intelligence, your strength, and your ability to see situations clearly rather than through the lens of inherited prejudice. Alva sank into the chair she had initially refused, the letter still clutched in her hands like evidence of a crime. "You investigated me. You learned about my background, my father's circumstances, the timing of my sale. You arranged to be at that auction at precisely the right moment to intervene." "Yes," Sten admitted without hesitation. "I did all of those things. But I want you to understand that the choice to marry you, the decision to bring you here and entrust you with the management of my household, the respect I have shown you, none of that was pretense. It was all based on careful evaluation of your character and capabilities, but not on love," Alva said, and was surprised by how much the admission hurt. "Not on romantic love, no," Sten agreed, "but on something I consider more valuable and more durable, mutual respect and shared purpose. What we have built together over these months, the partnership we have developed, the trust we have earned from each other, that is real. It was not planned or orchestrated. It grew naturally from the foundation we established." Alva looked down at the letter, reading again the coldly clinical language that reduced her to a set of useful characteristics. "Magnus Silvertongue was your agent in this. He identified me as suitable for your purposes." "Magnus has served my family for 20 years, Sten confirmed. "He understands the political currents of the region better than anyone, and he has contacts throughout the trading networks. When I asked him to identify women who might serve my needs, he provided several options. You were not the only possibility, but you were the one whose circumstances and character best matched what I was seeking. The revelation that she had been selected from multiple candidates somehow made the situation both better and worse. Better because it suggested genuine evaluation rather than random choice. Worse because it emphasized the calculated nature of what she had believed to be a spontaneous rescue." "And what happens now?" she asked. "Now that I know the truth about how our marriage began, what do you expect from me?" Sten returned to his chair, his expression grave but not apologetic. "I expect you to make your own choice about our future, based on complete information rather than the partial truth you had before. You know now that our marriage was arranged for political reasons, but you also know the respect and partnership we have developed since then. You can choose to stay and continue building what we have started, or you can choose to leave. I will not hold you to vows that were made under incomplete understanding. The offer of freedom, coming at the moment when she felt most trapped by circumstances beyond her control, was both generous and terrifying." Alva realized that she was being given something she had never possessed before, the opportunity to choose her path with full knowledge of the consequences. "If I stay," she said slowly, "it will be as your true partner, not as a political convenience or a household manager who happens to share your bed. I will need to understand all of your plans and commitments, all of the threats we face, and the strategies you employ to address them." "Agreed," Sten said without hesitation. "If you stay, it will be as my equal in all matters affecting our shared future. And if I leave, then you will leave with enough gold to establish yourself wherever you choose, and with documents that will protect you from anyone who might try to claim authority over you. Your freedom will be real and complete." Alva stood and walked to the window, looking out at the white landscape that had become her home. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the chimneys of the settlement's houses, evidence of the community that had come to depend on her leadership. Below in the harbor, Sten's longship sat frozen in ice that would not break until spring, a reminder of the journeys that had brought them both to this moment of decision. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," Sten replied. "The choice you make must be yours alone." As she left the study, with the letter still in her hand, Alva realized that the woman who had stood on the Skjoldheim auction platform 6 months earlier would have been grateful for any escape from her circumstances, regardless of the motives behind it. But the woman she had become since then, the mistress of Ironhold, the partner of Sten Ironsoul, the person who had discovered her own strength and capability, required something more substantial than mere rescue. She required truth, respect, and the chance to choose her own destiny with full knowledge of what that choice would mean. The days following Alva's discovery passed like the slow tolling of a funeral bell, each hour heavy with unspoken tension and careful politeness that fooled no one in the household. She continued her duties with the same efficiency that had won her respect throughout Ironhold. But Astrid and the other servants could sense the change in her demeanor, the way she held herself more stiffly, the absence of the quiet satisfaction that had previously marked her interactions with the estate's daily rhythms. Sten, for his part, gave her the space she had requested, while making it clear through small gestures that his offer of partnership remained genuine, regardless of her ultimate decision. He consulted her on household matters with the same respect he had always shown, included her in discussions about spring planning as if her presence was assured, and maintained the evening conversations that had become one of the few genuine pleasures of their unusual marriage. It was during one of these conversations, a week after her confrontation with the truth, that events began to accelerate toward a crisis that would test not just their personal relationship, but the very survival of everything they had built together. Ships have been sighted approaching from the south, Eric Stormcrow announced, bursting into the great hall where Alva and Sten sat before the fire. The bone chess set between them, though neither had made a move in several minutes. Multiple longships flying Bjorn Ravenshield's banner alongside others I do not recognize. The artifact that would define this approaching confrontation was already in Alva's possession. Though she did not yet understand its significance, a small silver key that Sten had given her weeks earlier, explaining only that it opened something important and that she should keep it safe. Now, as the implications of Eric's news settled over them like a burial shroud, she found herself unconsciously touching the key where it hung from a chain around her neck. Sten rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a warrior preparing for battle, his casual demeanor instantly replaced by the focused intensity that had made him legendary throughout the Northlands. "How many ships? How many men?" "7 ships," Eric replied, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of what such numbers meant. "Perhaps 300 warriors all told. Too many to be a diplomatic mission, too few to be an invasion fleet. This is something else entirely." Alva felt her stomach tighten as she understood the implications. This was not a raid or a conquest. It was an enforcement action, a coalition of jarls arriving to impose their will on someone who had defied their expectations of proper behavior. Her presence at Ironhold, her marriage to Sten, her very existence as a former slave elevated to noble status, had become a symbol of everything the established order found threatening. "They want to negotiate," Sten said, though his tone suggested he placed little faith in the possibility of peaceful resolution. If they intended simple conquest, they would have arrived in the spring, when movement was easier and supplies more readily available. Coming in winter suggests they believe their position is strong enough to force immediate compliance with their demands. "What demands?" Alva asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "My submission to their authority," Sten replied. "Recognition that my independence threatens the stability they believe necessary for their continued prosperity, and almost certainly the dissolution of our marriage as an offense against proper order and traditional values." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Alva realized that the choice she had been contemplating, whether to stay or leave, whether to build a future with Sten or seek independence elsewhere, had been rendered irrelevant by forces beyond their control. The coalition approaching Ironhold would not allow her the luxury of making her own decision about her life. Over the following hours, as watchtowers reported the steady approach of the hostile fleet, the household transformed itself from a peaceful community into a fortress preparing for siege. Sten's warriors, many of whom had sailed with him for decades, readied weapons and armor with the methodical efficiency of men who had faced overwhelming odds before. The civilian population, servants, craftsmen, farmers, and their families were moved to defensive positions within the most protected areas of the settlement. Alva found herself at the center of these preparations, not as a helpless woman to be protected, but as someone whose knowledge of the household's resources and organization was essential for survival. She worked with Astrid to inventory food supplies and medical provisions, calculated how long they could withstand a siege, and helped coordinate the movement of essential materials to secure locations. "You have a choice to make," Astrid said quietly, as they worked together to move silver and other valuables to a hidden chamber beneath the Great Hall. "Lord Sten would never admit it, but this conflict is largely about you. If you were to leave, voluntarily exile yourself for the good of the community, Bjorn and his allies might be satisfied with that victory." Alva paused in her work, a silver cup halfway to the concealment chest. "You think I should sacrifice myself to save everyone else? I think you should consider all possibilities," Astrid replied carefully, "including the possibility that your presence here has brought danger to people who had no voice in the decisions that created this situation." The observation stung because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. The servants and farmers of Ironhold had indeed played no role in Sten's choice to marry her, yet they would suffer the consequences if that choice led to violence and destruction. She was being asked to weigh her own newfound freedom and dignity against the welfare of an entire community. That evening, as the enemy fleet anchored just outside the harbor and made camp on the frozen shore, Sten called together his senior advisors to discuss strategy and options. The meeting took place in his private study, with maps of the surrounding terrain spread across his desk and weapons laid out for inspection and selection. "They will offer terms tomorrow," Olaf the Skald observed, his aged fingers tracing the defensive positions marked on the maps. "Bjorn is too intelligent to begin with violence when negotiation might accomplish his goals more efficiently." "And what terms will he offer?" Alva asked, surprising herself by speaking up in what was traditionally a council of war reserved for warriors and battle-tested advisors. "Safe passage for our people in exchange for my submission to the coalition's authority," Sten replied. "Recognition of their right to approve or disapprove my marriage choices. Payment of tribute to compensate for the inconvenience my independence has caused them. And almost certainly your return to a status more appropriate to your birth." The euphemism was clear enough. They wanted her reduced once again to property, her marriage annulled, her brief taste of dignity and respect erased, as if it had never existed. She would be returned to slavery or given to someone deemed more appropriate by men who viewed her elevation as an intolerable disruption of natural order. "They cannot simply dissolve a lawful marriage," Eric protested. Magnus Silvertongue performed the ceremony according to all proper traditions. "The union has been consummated and witnessed by honorable men. They can, if they have the strength to enforce their interpretation of law," Sten said grimly. "Might has always been the final arbiter of right in disputes between equals. The question is whether we have the strength to resist their demands." Alva listened to the discussion that followed. Detailed analysis of defensive positions, calculation of supplies and ammunition, assessment of the enemy's likely tactics and timeline. These were experienced warriors planning for a battle that might determine not just their own survival, but the future balance of power throughout the northern fjords. As the meeting continued, she found herself studying the faces around the table, men who had followed Sten through countless dangers, who had earned their wealth and status through courage and loyalty, who now faced potential death because their leader had chosen to marry a woman the established order deemed unacceptable. Their expressions showed no resentment toward her, only the grim determination of warriors preparing to face impossible odds for the sake of principles they believed worth defending. It was then that she made her decision, not the choice between staying and leaving that Sten had offered her, but a deeper choice about what kind of person she wanted to be and what kind of future she wanted to help create. "I want to understand exactly what we're fighting for," she said, her voice cutting through the tactical discussions with unexpected clarity. "Not just what we're fighting against, but what we hope to achieve if we somehow survive this confrontation." Sten looked at her with surprise and perhaps the beginning of approval. "Explain what you mean. If we defeat this coalition, others will follow. The established order will not simply accept our victory and leave us in peace. They will see us as a continuing threat to their authority, and they will keep coming until one of us is destroyed." Alva leaned forward, her hands flat on the table among the maps and weapons. "So what I want to know is this. Are we fighting just to preserve what we have, or are we fighting to prove something larger about how power should be distributed and how people should be allowed to choose their own destinies?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront the broader implications of their resistance. This was not merely a dispute over marriage customs or political authority. It was a conflict about fundamental questions of freedom, dignity, and the right of individuals to shape their own lives, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. "That," Sten said after a long moment, "is exactly the question we need to answer before tomorrow's negotiations begin." As the meeting broke up and the men dispersed to their final preparations, Alva remained behind with Sten in the study. Outside, the winter wind howled around the buildings of Ironhold, but inside, the fire crackled warmly while they sat in the comfortable silence that had become one of the defining characteristics of their relationship. "The key I gave you," Sten said eventually, "opens a chest hidden beneath the floor of the archive chamber. Inside, you will find documents that legally transfer ownership of Ironhold to you, along with enough gold to ensure your independence regardless of what happens to me tomorrow." Alva fingered the silver key at her throat, understanding now why he had given it to her weeks before this crisis erupted. "You planned for this possibility from the beginning." "I planned for many possibilities," Sten confirmed, "including my own death and your need to survive whatever consequences might follow. If I fall tomorrow, you will not be left defenseless or dependent on others for protection." The gift was staggering, not just the material wealth, but the trust it represented and the freedom it would guarantee. Even if everything else was lost, she would retain the means to choose her own path forward. "Thank you," she said simply, then added, "But I hope I will never need to use what you have given me." "So do I," Sten replied. "But hope is not a strategy. Preparation is." As they prepared to retire for what might be their last night together, Alva realized that her earlier concerns about the calculated nature of their marriage had become irrelevant. Whatever their relationship had begun as, it had evolved into something genuine and valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the determination to face whatever challenges arose together rather than separately. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine whether their defiance of traditional authority could survive in a world that viewed such defiance as an existential threat. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they had built something worth defending, something that represented hope for a different kind of future where strength served justice rather than mere dominance. Dawn broke grey and bitter over the frozen fjord, revealing 7 longships anchored like sleeping dragons in the harbour. Smoke rose from cooking fires along the shore, evidence that Bjorn Ravenshield intended to maintain his position for as long as necessary. The negotiation took place on neutral ground, the ice of the harbour itself, midway between the hostile fleet and Ironhold's defensive positions. Both sides brought small delegations, though the weapons each man carried made it clear that diplomacy balanced on the edge of violence. Alva stood at Sten's right hand as they walked across the frozen water, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The symbolism was not lost on her. She was literally walking on uncertain ground toward a confrontation that would determine whether the life she had built could survive the attempts of powerful men to tear it apart. Bjorn Ravenshield waited with 5 companions, all jarls whose territories gave them influence throughout the northern regions. These were mature men whose decisions affected thousands of lives and whose approval could make the difference between prosperity and starvation for entire communities. "Lord Sten," Bjorn said with careful courtesy, "thank you for agreeing to these discussions. I hope we can resolve our differences without unfortunate consequences for your people." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sten's response was equally measured. "Lord Bjorn, I confess curiosity about what grievances have brought you here in winter with such a substantial force." "Normal channels," replied Thorkel Ironbeard, one of the allied jarls, "are appropriate for normal circumstances. Your situation has moved beyond normal behavior." Alva felt their attention settle on her like physical weight, the combined gaze of men who viewed her presence as symbol of everything they found threatening about Sten's defiance. She kept her expression neutral, though her hand unconsciously moved to touch the silver key beneath her winter cloak. "Explain what you believe to be abnormal about my situation," Sten said. Bjorn stepped forward. "You married a slave, without consultation, without dowry negotiation, without consideration for the alliances such a decision affects. You have elevated someone of no breeding to authority over a great household. You have rejected political obligations in favor of personal preference." "I married a woman of my choice, according to lawful custom," Sten replied. "I have managed my household according to my judgment, while honoring my obligations to my people and allies." "Your independence threatens stability," interjected Magnus Wolfslayer. "When men of your influence reject traditional arrangements, it encourages others to similar defiance. The result is chaos." Alva listened with growing understanding of the forces arrayed against them. This was not really about her personally. Her elevation served as a symbol for their broader concerns. What these men feared was the precedent Sten's choices represented. "What terms do you offer?" Sten asked. Bjorn's smile held no warmth. "Acknowledgement of the coalition's authority in matters affecting regional stability, payment of compensation for the disruption your actions have caused, and dissolution of your irregular marriage, with appropriate disposition of the woman according to her proper station." The euphemism for slavery was clear enough, and Alva felt her resolve harden like ice forming on still water. "And if I refuse these terms?" Sten asked. "Then we will take by force what you will not grant through reason," Thorkel replied. "Your household will be scattered, your wealth distributed among those with legitimate claims to authority, and order will be restored through whatever means prove necessary." The negotiation had revealed demands that could not be accepted without destroying everything that made their resistance meaningful. But it had also revealed something else: the careful way Bjorn avoided direct threats against Sten himself, the emphasis on dissolution rather than annulment of their marriage. These men wanted Sten's submission, not his destruction. They needed him alive to serve as an example, which meant they could not simply overwhelm Ironhold without undermining their own objectives. As the two groups prepared to return to their respective positions, Alva made a decision that surprised everyone present, including herself. "Lord Bjorn," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the frozen harbor, "before these negotiations conclude, I would like to make my own proposal." The silence that followed Alva's words stretched across the frozen harbor like ice cracking under pressure. Every man present turned to stare at her, with expressions ranging from surprise to outrage. In a world where women did not presume to speak in councils of war, her intervention represented a fundamental breach of protocol. Bjorn recovered first, his face settling into cold amusement. "The woman speaks? How fascinating. Perhaps slavery has not taught her proper respect for her betters." "I am no longer a slave," Alva replied steadily. "I am the lawfully wedded wife of Sten Ironsoul, mistress of Ironhold, and a free woman with the right to speak in defense of my own interests." "Your interests," Thorkel Ironbeard scoffed, "are whatever your husband determines them to be. Women do not make proposals in matters of state." "Then perhaps it is time for that tradition to change," Alva said, feeling Sten's sharp intake of breath beside her. She withdrew the silver key from beneath her cloak, holding it up so winter light caught its polished surface. This key opens documents that make me the legal owner of Ironhold in the event of my husband's death. Lord Sten has already transferred ownership to ensure my protection and independence. Your quarrel is not just with him, it is with me as well. The revelation shocked the assembled jarls. Property ownership by women was not unknown, but the idea that a former slave could hold legal title to one of the region's most prosperous holdings challenged every assumption about proper social order. Impossible, Magnus Wolfslayer declared. No law speaker would validate such a transfer. Magnus Silvertongue has already done so, Sten said quietly. The documents are legally binding and properly witnessed. Alva saw understanding dawn in Bjorn's eyes as he grasped the implications. Even if they succeeded in forcing Sten's submission, they would still face a woman who possessed both legal ownership and the administrative skills to maintain independence. My proposal is simple, Alva continued. Single combat between champions, winner takes all. If your champion prevails, I will voluntarily renounce my ownership of Ironhold and submit to whatever judgment you deem appropriate. But if our champion wins, you will acknowledge my legal rights and withdraw your claims to authority over our household. And who would serve as your champion? Bjorn asked. I will, Sten said, his hand moving to the sword at his side. As is my right and duty as her husband. The proposal transformed their conflict from a political confrontation, involving hundreds of warriors, into a personal duel that would settle the matter with minimal bloodshed. It appealed to northern traditions while addressing the practical reality that neither side could afford massive casualties from a full siege. You would risk everything on one man's sword arm? Thorkel asked incredulously. I would risk everything on the strength of our convictions and the righteousness of our cause, Alva replied. The question is whether you have enough confidence in your position to accept the same risk. Bjorn studied her with new respect, clearly reassessing his initial impression. And if we refuse your proposal, then you face a siege against defenders who have nothing left to lose, Alva said simply. Your losses will be enormous, your victory Pyrrhic. And other jarls will note how much it cost you to impose your will on a single household. The truth of her words was evident in the expressions of Bjorn's companions. They had expected either quick capitulation or brief negotiated settlement. A costly siege was clearly not what they had intended. I accept your proposal, Bjorn said after silent consultation with his allies. Single combat, winner takes all. But I choose the terms of engagement. Agreed, Sten replied immediately. Combat will take place at dawn tomorrow on the ice of the harbor. No armor, weapons of choice, fight to the death or yield. Magnus Silvertongue will serve as judge to ensure fairness. As the two groups separated, Alva felt the weight of what she had accomplished. In minutes, she had transformed a hopeless political confrontation into a winnable personal contest. But she had also placed the life of the man she loved in mortal danger, walking back across the ice toward Ironhold. She realized that tomorrow's dawn would determine not just their personal fate, but the future of every person who dared to challenge the established order in pursuit of dignity and freedom. Dawn came like a blade, drawn from its sheath, sharp and cold and unforgiving. The harbor ice stretched before them like a natural arena, its surface swept clean by the wind and marked only by the footprints of the two men who would determine the fate of everyone who called Ironhold home. Sten stood at one end of the makeshift fighting ground, his massive frame relaxed despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. He had chosen his father's sword, a weapon that had served 3 generations of his family and whose balance was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Across from him, Bjorn's champion, a giant named Hegon Blood Eagle, tested the edge of his war axe with the casual confidence of a man who had never lost a single combat. The artifact that would define this final confrontation was neither weapon nor armor, but the simple gold wedding band that Alva wore on her finger, a circle that represented the bond they had forged through choice rather than circumstances. through respect rather than mere necessity. As she watched the two warriors prepare to fight for her freedom, she found herself turning the ring unconsciously, a gesture that had become her anchor in moments of uncertainty. Magnus Silvertongue stood between the combatants, his voice carrying clearly across the silent harbor as he recited the formal words that would govern their contest. Around the ice, representatives from both sides watched with the tense attention of people whose entire futures depended on the outcome of the next few minutes. "Combat begins at my signal," Magnus announced. "No quarter asked, none given. Victory by death or clear yield. Let the gods judge which cause is just." As the law speaker raised his hand to signal the beginning of combat, Alva felt time slow to a crawl. Every detail of the moment seemed heightened, the way morning light caught the steel of drawn weapons, the controlled breathing of warriors preparing for battle, the absolute silence that had settled over witnesses from both camps. The signal came, and both men moved with the fluid violence of predators unleashed. Hakon struck first, his war axe whistling through the air in a diagonal cut that would have split a lesser man from shoulder to hip. But Sten was not a lesser man. He flowed away from the attack like water around stone, his sword coming up to deflect the axe head, while his body pivoted to bring him inside his opponent's guard. For 20 minutes, they danced the ancient dance of warriors, each seeking the opening that would end the contest. Hakon was younger, stronger, his reach advantage with the axe keeping Sten at distance. But Sten possessed something that could not be taught or bought: the accumulated wisdom of 100 battles, the ability to read an opponent's intentions in the subtle shift of weight or the angle of a shoulder. The decisive moment came when Hakon, growing frustrated by his inability to land a killing blow, committed too fully to an overhead strike that left him momentarily off balance. Sten stepped inside the attack, his sword finding the gap beneath his opponent's raised arm and sliding between ribs to find the heart beneath. Hakon fell to his knees on the ice, surprise rather than pain on his face, as he realized that his legendary career had just ended. "Well fought," he managed to whisper before toppling forward onto the frozen harbor. The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly, as if waking from a shared dream, the witnesses began to react. Sten's supporters erupted in celebration, while Bjorn's men stood in stunned disbelief at their champion's defeat. Bjorn himself walked across the ice to where Sten stood over Hakon's body, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute finality. "The combat was fairly won. Your marriage stands. Your ownership of Ironhold is acknowledged, and your independence is recognized. The coalition withdraws its claims." But it was what happened next that truly marked the transformation of their world. Bjorn extended his hand to Alva, not to Sten, but to her directly, in a gesture of respect between equals. "Lady Alva," he said formally, "I misjudged both your character and your position. You have proven that worthiness is not a matter of birth, but of action. The Northern Jarls will remember this day, as Bjorn's fleet departed later that morning, taking with them the threat that had hung over Ironhold like a storm cloud. Alva found herself standing once again at the harbor's edge. But everything had changed since that first morning when she had arrived as Sten's unexpected bride. The household that gathered to celebrate their victory was no longer just a collection of servants and retainers. They had become a community, bound together by shared principles rather than mere economic necessity. The changes Alva had implemented were no longer just administrative improvements, but symbols of a different way of organizing power and responsibility. That evening, as they sat before the fire in the great hall with the bone chest set between them, Sten reached across the board to take her hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had built together and everything they had just defended. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "The deception that brought us together, the danger that followed, the choice to risk everything on principle rather than accepting an easier path." Alva considered the question seriously, thinking back to the frightened woman who had stood on the Skjoldheim auction block with a sack over her head. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone she had been rather than someone she was. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "Not the calculated nature of our beginning, not the discovery of your political motivations, not even the risks we faced to defend what we built. All of it was necessary to become who we are now." Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the great hall of Ironhold, warmth and light prevailed. They had proven that love could grow from respect, that strength could serve justice, and that even the most carefully laid plans could evolve into something genuine and lasting. The silver arm ring that had once marked Alva as property now caught the firelight as she moved her chess pieces, a reminder of how far they had traveled from that first moment of rescue to this moment of hard-won peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did, but they would face them together as equals who had chosen each other not once, but many times over. In the end, that choice, renewed daily through small acts of respect and large gestures of trust, had proven stronger than tradition, more durable than political convenience, and more valuable than all the gold in their carefully managed treasury. They had built something worth defending, and in defending it, they had discovered that freedom was not a gift to be received, but a responsibility to be shared.